So now we're going to move on to one of the most interesting topics, which is Ibn Zubair and the Kaaba. So without further ado, let's start.
The governor in the Holy City was Abdullah ibn Zubair.
So the first thing he says is that Abdullah ibn Zaber was the governor of Makkah, and he was not the governor of Makkah. According to the history of Al-Tabari, and I'm going to be quoting from the history of Al-Tabari because Dan, he quotes from the history of Al-Tabari as well, so it's only fair that I used this book as well. It says that Ibn al-Zubayr set out and came to Makkah while Amr bin Sa'id was governor there. When he entered, he said, I am seeking refuge. So he was not a governor of Makkah, and he was simply seeking refuge there from Yazid. Now, it's another place in Al-Tabari on page 90, it says, in this year, Yazid bin Muawiyah dismissed Al-Walid bin Utbah as governor of Mecca and appointed Amr bin Sa'id. That was in the month of Ramadan. Now, what this means is that Yazid bin Muawiyah is the one who can appoint and dismiss people from being the governor. Why? Because he is the Khalifa, and the Khalifa Yazid bin Muawiyah, he hated Abdullah bin Zubair. So of course he would never appoint Abdullah bin Zubair as the governor of Makkah. Therefore Abdullah ibn Zubair was not the governor of Makkah. Maybe once Abdullah ibn Zubair decided that he himself is worthy of being Khalifa, he might have appointed himself as the governor, but that's later on, and I don't think that he was ever the governor of Makkah. On page 11 it says, however, Waqidi reports that he, Al-Harith bin Khalid al-Maqsumi, was governor of Mecca when Yazid died. So even when Yazid died, Abdullah bin Zubair was not the governor of Mecca, other people were. So this is, I know this is quite pedantic, but I want to make sure that everything is crystal clear and everything is said correctly.
He was particularly unhappy. In his eyes, the Holy City was the most important city of Islam, the mother of all cities. But the Umayyad rulers chose Damascus as the new capital city.
Now, Dan Gibson gives the impression that this infighting or this civil war started from a disagreement about which is the holy city, and this is completely false. It had nothing to do with whether Makkah was the holy city. Of course, everyone knew it was the mother of all cities. It says in the Quran. So, of course, this was not an issue. Of course, and also they did make Damascus the capital city, of course, but that has nothing to do with it. And Abdullah bin Zubayr did not oppose to that, and the other companions that did not like Yazid, they were not opposed to the fact that he was in Damascus. And the evidence for this is that Muawiyah, Yazid's dad, he was the Khalifa, and he was in Damascus, and they pledged allegiance to him. So they agreed with what he was doing, but they didn't agree with what his son was doing, although both of them were in Damascus, and they had the same opinions. So, because it was not about what was the holy city, what was this, it was about who was pious and who was religious. According to the history of Al-Tabari, volume 18, it says that the people acknowledged Yazid bin Muawiyah except for Al-Hussein bin Ali, etc. So it says they acknowledged Muawiyah. So it says, so when Muawiyah came to Al-Madinah, he sent for Al-Hussein bin Ali, saying, O cousin, the people have been able to acknowledge Yazid except for 5 persons of the Quraysh whom you lead. So this was not to do with what was the holy city, because Muawiyah and his son Yazid both had the same opinion. However, they followed Muawiyah, but they didn't want to follow Yazid. Now, why is it that they didn't want to follow Yazid? Well, history of Al-Tabari, he mentions that when those members of the delegation from Medina, who were the elite companions of the Prophet, when they came back, they stood among the people and publicly cursed and vilified Yazid. They said, we have come from a man who has no religion, who drinks wine, who plays lutes, who passes his time with songstresses, who plays with dogs, and spends his evening talking to robbers and young men. We ask you to bear witness that we repudiate him. The people followed him. So it had nothing to do with what was the holy city, what was that. Now, Dan Gibson says this because he wants to create this sort of false idea that because of this, then it's going to lead suddenly to Abdullah ibn Zubair changing Makkah. But the fundamental needs to be corrected here. It had nothing to do with what was the holy city. The main thing is that they didn't want to pledge allegiance to someone who was a sinner, who lacks religion. Imagine you're talking about the best among the best of the companions of the Prophet. Of course, they're going to say, oh, we're not going to follow someone who drinks wine, etc. So this was the issue. It had nothing to do with what was the holy city.
The Umayyads reacted strongly and sent an army against the holy city. Ibn Zubayr then did a shocking thing. He destroyed the Kaaba, the ancient holy shrine of Islam.
So now he says, during the infighting, Abdullah bin Zaber did a shocking thing. He destroyed the Kaaba. Now, he makes it sound dramatic when what actually happened was the people who were fighting Abdullah ibn Zubair, they destroyed the Kaaba by damaging it and by setting it on fire. Then what happened was Abdullah bin Zubair, because it was so damaged, Abdullah bin Zubair knocked it down, he demolished it so that he can rebuild it. Now, I wouldn't say that means that he destroyed it because, destroy would mean like obliterate. So I wouldn't use the word he destroyed the Kaaba. That's sort of like a wrong usage in my opinion. According to the history of Al-Tabari, he mentions that he reached Mecca on the 24th of Al-Muharram. He besieged Ibn al-Zubayr for 60 days until the news of the death of Yazid bin Muawiyah reached him at the beginning of Rabi al-Akhir. In this year, the Kaaba was set on fire. Someone says, I saw that the Yemeni corner of the Kaaba was black and had been cracked in 3 places. So there was a fire that was caused by the people who were throwing rocks and different things in Makkah. The reason why they sieged Makkah was because they were not allowed to fight in Makkah. It says in the Quran, وَلَوْ دَخَلَهُ كَانَ آمِنًا, whoever enters Makkah is safe. So they sieged Makkah, but obviously it beats the purpose if you're throwing stuff in Makkah as well. So I don't understand why they even decided to siege Makkah but destroy things in Makkah. It doesn't make any sense. Now, Al-Tabari also mentions that on Saturday, 3 Rabi al-Awwal, they hurled stones and wood at the sacred house with ballistae and they set it on fire. So remember, Abdullah bin Zubair did not destroy the Kaaba. These people are the ones who did it. They were fighting with Abdullah bin Zubair. Abdullah bin Zubair took refuge in Makkah so that he's safe, and obviously they sieged Makkah because they were not allowed to go inside it and kill him. So they start throwing stuff in Makkah like wood, stones, etc. And it damaged the Kaaba and it damaged the walls. It set it on fire because there was like a fire that was next to it, and obviously it must have hit it and set the Kaaba on fire. So Abdullah bin Zubair did not do a shocking thing and destroy Kaaba. Let's get that straight. Al-Tabari also mentions Abu Ja'far al-Tabari said that in this year also Ibn Zubair demolished the Kaaba. Its walls had buckled as a result of the catapult stones which had been fired at it. So remember, this was not Abdullah bin Zubair. Abdullah bin Zubair would never destroy Kaaba for no reason. What he wanted to do was he wanted to knock it down because it was so damaged, and he wanted to rebuild it in the way of Abraham. And I'll explain what I mean by that he wanted to rebuild it in the way of Abraham later on.
Ibn Zubayr then demolished the Kaaba sanctuary until he had leveled it to the ground and dug out its foundation.
Now, he makes it sound so dramatic because he wants the normal person who's not going to look further into it to believe that Abdullah ibn Zubair did a shocking thing. He destroyed the Kaaba, he obliterated it, he dug out its foundation so that people don't know where it is. But this is further from the truth. He says, Ibn Zubair demolished the sanctuary until he had leveled it to the ground and he dug out its foundation. One thing that he's missing out though is he's doing an extremely misleading thing here, is that he's skipped out purposely the next part of the statement. Like, the statement doesn't end there. He's put a full stop there. It says in the history of Al-Tabari, it says he dug out his foundation and made the Hijra a part of it. Now, why is it that he skipped out the part and made the Hijra a part of it? I'll tell you why. So what is a Hijra? The Hijra is this part here. Can you see the 2 arrows in red? That is the Hijra of the Kaaba. Now, it's also called Hijra Ismail. And what it is that when Abraham built the Kaaba, he didn't build it in the shape of a cube. He built it in the shape of a cuboid. And he included this Hijra as part of the Kaaba. Now, what happened was that there was a flood in Makkah, which destroyed sort of some parts of the Kaaba, and this was at the time of the Prophet, before he received prophethood. And what happened was that they decided to rebuild the Kaaba, and when they were rebuilding the Kaaba, they had a lack of resources, and so they decided to build the Kaaba in the shape of a cube, and therefore that's the reason why today we have the Kaaba in the shape of a cube. However, the Prophet always wanted the Kaaba to be in the shape of a cuboid because that was the original building of Abraham. So that is the history of Al-Hijr, and that is the reason why he avoids to quote it. So now you can see the clear deception by Dan Gibson by purposely missing out the end part, which is he dug out its foundation and made the Hijr a part of it. Why? Because if you're making a Hijr a part of the Kaaba, it must mean then that the same location at which this Kaaba is being demolished, it's being rebuilt with the Hijr a part of it. Why? Because there is no other way that you'll be digging out the foundation and making a Hijr a part of it. The reason why is because when Abraham built it, he dug out its foundation. So what Ibn Zubayr wanted to do was he first of all, in later hadith, you're going to see that he saw the rocks, the stones that Abraham originally made it in, and also he wanted to include the Hijr as part of it. Now the second thing is that if Abdullah bin Zubayr was moving the Kaaba, he would not know what a Hijr is. So it would be contradictory for him to include the Hijr as part of it because he wouldn't know what it is. But at the time of the Prophet marked and showed Aisha, his wife, exactly where the Hijr was. So Abdullah ibn Zubayr found out where this was and he included it as part of the Kaaba. However, if Abdullah ibn Zubayr moved the Kaaba, there is no such thing as a Hijr because he's just making it up. So he can't make the Hijr a part of it because there is no Hijr. So the only way that there is a Hijr is in the original location. So it is very clear that Abdullah ibn Zubayr did not rebuild the Kaaba in a new location. Another thing is that if you're demolishing the Kaaba so that you can move it somewhere else, why would you need to dig out its foundation for? It doesn't make any sense. Fine, you destroy the Kaaba, okay, move on. You can move it into another location, but why do you need to dig out its foundation for? It doesn't make any sense. So that's the reason why he purposely left out the words and made the Hijr a part of it. And this is clear deception. And I've shown throughout this series that it's very clear that he's fabricating things. He's changing Islamic literature to try and fit his narrative, and it's completely wrong. So what is the truth? Well, the truth is that Abdullah ibn Zubayr, the reason why he demolished the Kaaba was so that he can rebuild the Kaaba and include the Hijr as part of it. So the reason why he wanted to do that is because he wanted to create the Kaaba in the way that Abraham did and the way that the Prophet wanted people to do that. The reason why the Prophet didn't want people to keep rebuilding the Kaaba is because the Muslims there were recent converts. So it would have confused them a lot. It says in Sahih Bukhari, narrated Aisha, that the wife of the Prophet, Allah's messenger, said to her, "Don't you see that when your folk built the Kaaba, they did not build it on all the foundations built by Abraham?" I said, "Oh Allah's messenger, why don't we rebuild it on the foundations of Abraham?" He said, "But for the fact that your folk have recently given up infidelity, I would have done so." Now, narrated Ibn Umar, Aisha must have heard from Allah's messenger, "For I see that Allah's messenger used not to touch the two corners facing Al-Hijr only because the house had not been built on the foundations of Abraham." So what this means is that the Prophet, he acknowledged that the specific the shape of the Kaaba was not the correct shape. That's why he wouldn't touch the two corners facing Al-Hijr, because that was not considered to be part of the Kaaba. And it's very clear that the Prophet wanted to rebuild the Kaaba in the shape of Abraham and in the way of Abraham, because it wasn't just the shape of the Kaaba, it was also the fact that Abraham's Kaaba had two doors and lots of different things. So what Abdullah ibn Zubayr did, because he heard that from his aunt, his mum's sister. Remember Abdullah ibn Zubayr, his mum was Asma bin Abu Bakr, and her sister was Aisha, who heard it from the Prophet. So this is like clear evidence, and he heard it from his own mum. So this is the reason why he wanted to rebuild the Kaaba in the way of Abraham. He did not move the Kaaba. It doesn't make any sense for Abdullah ibn Zubayr to want to rebuild the Kaaba in the way of Abraham and in the way of the Prophet, in the exact specification that the Prophet wanted to build the Kaaba on, but he wanted to rebuild it in another location. It doesn't make any sense. So further evidence from the history of Al-Tabari, he mentions the story very clearly that Abdullah ibn Zubayr wanted to rebuild the Kaaba in the way of the Prophet and in the way of Abraham, and he wanted to include different things like giving it two doors, etc. In the history of Al-Tabari, he mentions that Abdullah ibn Zubair said, "My mother Asma bint Abi Bakr told me that the Messenger of God said to Aisha, if it were not that your people had only recently been in a state of unbelief, I would restore the Kaaba on the foundations of Abraham, and I would add to the Kaaba part of the Hijr." Ibn al-Zubayr gave the order for it, and it was excavated, and they found rocks as big as a camel, and they moved a boulder of them, and a bright light flashed out. They re-established it on its foundation, and Ibn al-Zubayr rebuilt it, giving it 2 doors, from one of which it was entered and from the other vacated. Now, does this sound like someone who wants to move the Kaaba to I don't know, what's the 1,000 kilometers away? Does it sound like someone who wants to move the Kaaba? Of course it doesn't. It's an absolute lie. It's an absolute lie that Ibn Zubayr moved the Kaaba. He did not move the Kaaba. In fact, he wanted to rebuild the Kaaba in the specific way that the Prophet wanted, with 2 doors, including the Hijra, and he dug out his foundations because he wanted to include the Hijra as part of it. He didn't dig out his foundation so that he can get rid of any evidence and then he can move to Makkah and then rebuild the Kaaba. It doesn't make any sense at all.
The problem we face here is one of timing. The Islamic records are quite clear that when the Caliph died, his 13-year-old son ruled in his place. Al-Tabari, Volume 20, tells us specifically that his son survived only 40 days after his father died before he too was killed. During this time, the armies from the Holy City returned to Damascus. Now, a slow-moving army would have taken many days to cover the 1,400-kilometer trek across the desert from Mecca in Saudi Arabia to Damascus in Syria. If the army could move at 20 miles a day, it still would have taken them 43 days. When you add up the time the messenger took to bring the message, the time it took for the army to decide to return and get mobilized, and the 43-day march, there is simply not enough time. Mecca is too far away to be believable.
So what he's saying here is he's mentioning that after Yazid passed away, his son Muawiyah took reign for only 40 days. Now he's saying that the Syrian army was in Makkah, so there would have been no way that they could have returned during the reign of Muawiyah bin Yazid, who only reigned for 40 days, because it would have taken them longer than 40 days to get back to Damascus, and therefore they could not have been there during the reign of Muawiyah bin Yazid. Now he's correct, and there is no evidence in any Islamic literature that points to the fact that the Syrian army reached Damascus during the reign of Muawiyah bin Yazid. There is no evidence at all. There's no evidence that they reached there within a specific amount of time. They just says that they reached to Syria, that they continued until they reached to Syria. It doesn't specify whether it took them 40 days, 50 days, or 60 days. Now, this is from the History of Al-Tabari, Volume 20, where it says, there, Yazid bin Muawiyah had willed that the oath of allegiance be given to his son Muawiyah bin Yazid, but the latter survived for only 3 months. Some narrations say he only survived for 3 months, 90 days. According to Awana, Yazid bin Muawiyah designated his son Muawiyah bin Yazid as Khalif, but the latter only survived 40 days. So some people say 40 days, some people say 3 months, but still there is no evidence that says that the Syrian army reached there within the span which Muawiyah bin Yazid was ruling. Now, in the same page, it says, Umar told me on the authority of Ali bin Muhammad, when Muawiyah bin Yazid had been designated Khalif, he gathered together the officials of his father, and the oath of allegiance given to him in Damascus. He perished there after 40 days of his rule. So being the Khalifa doesn't mean you have to have a pledge of allegiance from the Syrian army. You can have the pledge of allegiance from the group of people who acknowledge you as being the Khalifa. So even if it was the officials and the elders of the people in Damascus who were probably serving his father Yazid bin Muawiyah, then that would have been sufficient. But the truth is that there is no evidence that they reached there during the reign of Yazid. So I don't know why Danny Gibson is making a big deal out of it when there's absolutely no evidence that they reached there within any specific time period. So Al-Tabari mentions something very interesting here. So basically, at the time of Makkah, during this infighting, what happened was that Abdullah ibn Zubayr was fighting the commander of Yazid, whose name was Al-Hussein bin Numair. Now, once the news reached Al-Hussein bin Numair that Yazid passed away, basically Al-Hussein, he liked Abdullah bin Zubayr, and he thought that he was worthy of being the Khalifa. So after the death of Yazid, straight away, Al-Hussein bin Umar said to Abdullah bin Zubayr, why don't you become the Khalifa? I'll take you to Syria, to Damascus, and we can make you the Khalifa, because I think you deserve to be the Khalifa. Now, obviously, something happened. Abdullah bin Zubayr said no. But Al-Tabari mentions this. So he continued with his men and those with him in the direction of Medina. Now this is problematic. Why? Because if Makkah is in Petra, why would you be going from Petra to Syria? Because you'd go back to Syria because you've heard that your leader's dead. So they were heading to Syria. But why would you pass by Medina? It doesn't make any sense why they would pass by Medina. And evidence that they did go to Medina was that they met Ali bin al-Hussein bin Ali bin Abi Talib, who was from Medina. The second evidence is that it says the people of Medina and Hijaz became emboldened against the Syrians, who were humiliated so much that XYZ. The member of the Umayyad family said to them, do not leave without taking us with you to Syria. So he's talking about the Syrian army that was led by Al-Hussein bin Numair. So it's very clear that he was in Medina. So it says that, so they did that and the army continued until it reached Syria. So on the way to Syria, they passed by Medina. Now, how can you pass by Medina if Makkah is in Petra? It's impossible. So this is another type of evidence that that Makkah is not in Petra, because it was on the way from Makkah to Syria. On the way was Medina, and they stopped at Medina. If you want to see this on a map, here it is. So if you look on this map here, you can see that if Al-Hussein bin Numair was in, and his Syrian army were in Petra, then once they heard of the news of Yazid's passing, they would have gone straight to Syria to sort out the issue of the Khalifa. However, there is no mention anywhere in Islamic literature that they even met Muawiyah bin Yazid. And second of all, this journey here would have taken, well, 330 kilometers. I probably would have said it would have taken them about a week to get to Damascus, like maximum a week. And however, from the narration that Al-Hussein bin Numair went to Medina, and then from Medina he went to Damascus, it doesn't make any sense, because this would have been the journey. So this is what Al-Tabari mentions. He says that he went and he passed by Medina, and he went into Medina, and then from Medina he met some Syrian people and some members of the Umayyad family who said, come take us with you. So they took a caravan from Medina to Damascus. Now this does not make any sense, because this journey is just too long and unnecessary. Why did he have to go to Medina? It doesn't make any sense. And this journey would have been 1,800 kilometers away, which is 5 times the journey that it would have taken from Petra to Damascus. And it would have probably taken about 5 weeks, which is at least 35 days to get from Petra to Medina and then from Medina to Damascus. It doesn't make any sense at all why Al-Hussein bin Numair, who's been fighting with his massive army, he's got a massive army with him, why would they travel all that way to Medina and then from Medina go all the way to Damascus when the goal is Damascus? It doesn't make any sense. What would have made sense is that if Makkah is in its original location where it is now, and on the way to Syria, they stopped off at Medina. Why? Because Medina's on the way. And that is the best explanation, because it just doesn't make sense that Al-Hussein bin Numair and his massive army decided to travel all the way 800 kilometers to Medina and then go from Medina to Damascus. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Look at this. For year 70, Al-Tabari only records a few lines of text. Did he not find any more information for this year? Or did later editors censor this year from Al-Tabari's record? Only a few lines, but what he records gives us a few tantalizing details. It tells us that Musa'ib ibn Zubair, apparently a brother of Abdullah, brings supplies to the holy city. Were these supplies military equipment? No, it says he brought many horses and camels.
Now, what he's referring to is this part here where it says, during this year, Mus'ab bin al-Zubair went to Mecca bringing a great deal of money, which he divided among his kinsmen and others. He brought many horses and camels and much baggage. He sent much money to Abdullah bin Safwan, etc. And he slaughtered many fattened camels. Now, Dan's saying that the reason why he brought horses and camels was so that they can prepare to leave Petra with thousands, 10,000 people, and completely leave Petra and go for Makkah for whatever reason, I don't know. But the point is that he mentions that they only brought horses and camels, which is not true. They brought much baggage, meaning that they must have brought clothes, this and that, because it's very obvious that if they brought clothes, etc., Dan Gibson wouldn't have wanted to include it. And it said they brought much baggage. So it wasn't just camels and horses and they said, okay, let's go now. They brought loads and loads and loads of things. And it also says that he also slaughtered many fattened camels. Now, if these camels were supposed to be for transportation, why is he slaughtering many of them? So it's very clear that just because he brings horses and camels and money, it doesn't mean that they're leaving the town. And this is something that Dan's trying to get at and trying to, manipulate and say, oh, he's bringing horses and camels, which means that he wants to migrate from Petra to modern day Makkah. It's a bit silly. And he also mentioned something else where he's about to kill someone, and then they said, look, we face the same Qibla as you. It's a very silly issue, because all he's saying is the similarities. If you read the whole narration by Al-Tabari, he mentions lots of similar things. We're the same tribe as you, this etc. It's like, let's say if you want to save yourself, you'd associate similarities with that person. So if you're his brother, you'd say, look, we have the same mom, we have the same dad. If you're from the same tribe, you say, oh, look, we're from the same tribe, we know this person, that person. So it's only to save them. It has nothing to do with, okay, I'm going to accept your Qibla now. It has nothing to do with that. Another thing he mentions is when Al-Tabari mentions little detail about, the issue in 70 AH, but that doesn't mean anything. It's just pure speculation. So now I want to analyze the evidences from Al-Tabari against Petra, so against the argument that Makkah is in Petra. So the first point I want to make is with regards to the order of battles from Yazid I. So Yazid was the Khalifa, and he had the people from Medina and the people from Makkah rejecting him as the Khalifa. So now he declared war on them, and you'd hear about the Battle of Hijra, which is in Medina, and then the siege of Makkah, which was with Abdullah bin Zaber. Now, logically, you would have thought that from Damascus, he would have conquered Makkah first, and then once he's killed Abdullah bin Zaber, he would go to Medina, because that's the logical route. But read what Tabari mentions. He says, when Muslim bin Uqba had finished fighting the people of Medina and the 3 days of the plundering of their property by his army, he set out with those of his army who were with him in the direction of Mecca. Now, this means that they went to Medina first and then they went to Mecca, but this just doesn't make any sense. Now, let me show you this visually. So here is Petra, which is pinpointed in red. And so what Yazid should have done is sent his army from Damascus to Petra, defeated Ibn Zubair if he was in Makkah, and then obviously if you need reinforcement you can quickly get it because you're very close to Damascus, or if you want to send some armies back, you can send some armies back who are injured, etc. And then from Petra you would have sent an army from Petra to Medina, and then from Medina you would go back to Damascus. However, that was not the case. What actually happened was that he sent an army from Damascus to Medina. Now, if Makkah was in Petra, then that would have meant that he went all the way from Damascus to Medina, then from Medina back to Petra, and then from Petra back to Damascus. But this doesn't make any sense, because we know that Yazid, obviously he conducted the Battle of Hijra, and then what happened after the Battle of Hijra was the siege of Makkah. So it's very clear that they went from Damascus straight to Medina, then from Medina they went to Makkah. Now this doesn't make any sense, because why would an army be sent from Damascus all the way to Medina when logically it would have made sense to move your army from Damascus to Makkah because it's closer? And how armies work is that they want to conquer their nearby lands before they go somewhere far. It's not logical for them to want to defeat an army that's further away when there's an army that's against him that's closer. So this is the this is what doesn't make any sense. So the first thing is the lineage of Abdullah ibn Zubair, and the fact that someone of that quality of lineage would not commit such an atrocious crime of moving the Kaaba. Now, on the right here, you can see that Abdullah ibn Zubair, his father was Zubair ibn al-Awwam, and Zubair ibn al-Awwam was the one who was given the glad tidings of paradise, and he was one of the first ones to accept Islam and one of the closest companions to the Prophet. Now, Zubair's auntie was Khadija. Now, Khadija was the first wife and the greatest wife of the Prophet Muhammad, and she was also granted paradise. The Prophet mentioned that she was in paradise. Zubair, who was Abdullah's father, his mother was Safiya bint Abdul Muttalib, and obviously Safiya's brother was Abdullah, and Abdullah's son was Prophet Muhammad. So Safiya was the auntie of the Prophet Muhammad. On the mother side of Abdullah was Asma. Now Asma was the sister of Aisha, and Aisha was the wife of the Prophet. And Aisha is one of the most famous wives of the Prophet because she was the youngest, and she narrated the most hadith. She was a scholar of Islam. And also Aisha's father was Abu Bakr Siddiq, and Abu Bakr Siddiq was the closest and the greatest companion of the Prophet, and he was the first Khalifa after the Prophet died. So in terms of the lineage of Abdullah ibn Zubair, his lineage is so pure that for someone to do such an atrocious crime, it's just unthinkable. And you might think, but what does lineage have to do with morality of your actions? But when someone has such a pure lineage, it's just unthinkable that they could do such an atrocious crime. Now, the second point is with regards to the character of Abdullah ibn Zubair. Now, he was a Sahabi, and Sahabis are given a very, very, very high rank, and they're known as the greatest after the Prophet. So, and also he narrated hadith as well. And obviously the Prophet said that anyone who follows one of my companions will not be led astray. And he was also one of the first to be born in Medina. He was the first to be born in Medina after Hijra. And he was a blessing for the Muslims. And the first person to put food in his mouth was the Prophet Muhammad. And the first to give the call of prayer in his ear was Abu Bakr Siddiq, his grandfather. And so that was an absolute honor. And at the time of Umar ibn Khattab, he was present at the Battle of Yarmouk with his father. And obviously he was too young to fight, but he was present there. At the time of the Khalifa of Uthman bin Affan, he did fight and he fought courageously in a battle in North Africa. And he was also entrusted by Uthman bin Affan to compile the Quran. So there was a couple of people, maybe 4 or 5 people who were entrusted by Uthman to compile the Quran, and Abdullah ibn Zubair was one of them. So imagine the Khalifa, Uthman, trust Abdullah ibn Zubair so much with the compilation of the Quran, and Dan Gibson is saying that this same person is the one who decides for no reason whatsoever to attempt to move Makkah, to move 10,000 people to an unknown area and to rebuild the Kaaba and to pretend that this is the new Makkah. Like, it's just ridiculous. Now, here are some words from other people about Abdullah ibn Zubair. So, Ata in Hilyatul Awliya says, when Abdullah ibn Zubair radiallahu anh stood up to pray, he becomes so deeply absorbed that he is like a reed stick. So his, if you like, khushu' or sincerity or devotion is so much that it seems like he's just staying still and he's not moving at all. Asma bint Abu Bakr, his mother said, the son of al-Zubair, Abdullah ibn Zubair, used to observe long night prayers, fast during the days, and he used to be called the pigeon of the mosque. Ibn Rajab, who was a Hanbali scholar, says, when Abdullah ibn Zubair, Allah be pleased with him, stood up to pray, he would be like a stick, immobile, with khushu', with sincerity and devotion. Once he was prostrating when a missile from a catapult was launched at him when Makkah was being besieged, and part of his garment was torn away whilst he was praying, but he did not even raise his head. So the sincerity and the piety of Abdullah ibn Zubair was so much that it's very, very, very unlikely that someone who is so religious and who was a companion of the Prophet, who narrated hadith, who has an unmatched lineage, who is compiled the Quran at the time of Uthman, who was fighting battles at the time of Uthman, for someone to then say, you know what, I want to move the Kaaba for no reason whatsoever, just for fun, because I don't know, I want to create a fake Makkah and pretend and do Hajj in a fake location. It's just ridiculous. Now, the third evidence, which is against the Petra argument, is with regards to Abdullah ibn Zubair denying caliphate for Makkah. Now, on the first siege of Makkah, when Al-Hussein bin Numair, who was the commander of Yazid, sieged Makkah for around 40 days, after he heard of Yazid passing away, now he was sort of the one in charge. So after that, he actually believed that Abdullah ibn Zubair, who was in Makkah, deserved to be the Khalifa because of his elite status. So after Yazid passed away, as soon as Yazid passed away, he heard of that. He went to Abdullah ibn Zubair and said, come with me to Syria and I will make you the Khalifa. I will literally make you the Khalifa. Just come with me to Syria. But Abdullah ibn Zubair did not want to go, and this is the reason why. So in the history of Al-Tabari, he mentions why. Sa'id bin Amr used to say that the only thing which prevented Ibn al-Zubair accepting the oath of allegiance from them and leaving for Syria was a foreboding, because it was at Makkah where God protected him. That was from the army of Marwan. So this was the reason why Abdullah ibn Zubair did not want to accept to be the Khalifa, because he did not want to leave Makkah, because when he was in Makkah he was protected. So imagine someone who doesn't want to leave Makkah for Caliphate, basically the greatest honor which he wanted. He didn't want to leave Makkah for that. And Dan Gibson is asserting that this same person not only left Makkah, but he moved Makkah and he moved it to a fake location, and he tried to convince people that this was the new Makkah. Does that even make sense at all? Of course not, because he even denied Caliphate just so that he can be protected in Makkah. And on page 4 it says, as for going to Syria, I will not do it, for I do not like to leave Makkah, but give me the oath of allegiance here and I will grant you security and act justly among you. So he did not want to leave Makkah. So this is a killer for the Petra argument and the argument that Abdullah ibn Zubair moved the Kaaba, because he didn't even want to leave Makkah to become the Khalifa. Forget about leaving Makkah and inventing a new Makkah. So this is the third evidence. So the fourth evidence is with regards to Al-Hussein bin Numair heading for Medina. Now, this is on the first siege of Makkah when Yazid passes away, and obviously Al-Hussein bin Numair asks Abdullah ibn Zubair to come with him to Syria so he can become the Khalifa, and Abdullah ibn Zubair says no because he's protected in Makkah. So Al-Hussein bin Numair heads towards Syria. But it says he heads for Medina. Now, this does not make sense if you're going from Makkah to Syria, and if Makkah is in Petra, because that would be going from Jordan to Syria, and in that route, you don't pass through Medina. It doesn't make any sense because you don't go through Medina. So it says over here, so he continued with his men and those with him in the direction of Medina. Now, it doesn't make any sense. How can you continue in the direction of Medina? The only way for this to happen is if Medina is in between Makkah and Syria. Then that makes sense, because on the way you head towards Medina, you stop off at Medina, and then when you're at Medina, then you can travel to Syria. And it's evidence that not only did they head in the direction of Medina, but they actually went to Medina. It says Ali bin al-Hussein bin Ali bin Abi Talib met him, and obviously we know he was in Medina. And it also says that the people of Medina and Hijaz became emboldened against the Syrians, who were humiliated so much that etc. The members of the Umayyad family said to them, do not leave without taking us with you to Syria. So they did that, and the army continued until it reached Syria. So the army was in Medina, and they took some members of the Umayyad family with them to Syria. So it's very clear that they went to Medina. That this doesn't make sense, because if you're in Petra, why would you go all the way down to Medina and then from Medina go all the way to Syria? It doesn't make any sense. The only way to explain it is if Makkah is in its current location now, and that's the correct location, and on the way they stopped off at Medina, that makes perfect sense. But this is a killer for the Petra argument. So the fifth evidence is that Abdullah ibn Zubayr rebuilt the Kaaba in the way of Abraham. Now, I explained before that the Hijra was included as part of it, and the reason why he dug out his foundation was to include the Hijra as part of it. Now, this is a hadith, a Sahih hadith in Sunan an-Nasai 2903, where it says, where the Prophet says to Aisha, "O Aisha, were it not for the fact that your people have recently left Jahiliyyah, I would have commanded that the house be knocked down, and I would have incorporated into it what was left out of it. I would have made its door in level with the ground, and I would have given it two doors, an eastern door and a western door, for they built it too small, and by doing it, it would have been built on the foundation of Ibrahim, peace be upon him." He, one of the narrators, said, "This is what motivated Ibn al-Zubayr to knock it down." Yazid said, "I saw Ibn al-Zubayr when he knocked it down and rebuilt it and included part of the Hijr in it." Now, the first thing is, if he saw Abdullah ibn Zubayr rebuilding it in another location, he would have said that. He would have said, "I saw Abdullah ibn Zubayr move in the Kaaba, move in Makkah, or rebuilding the Kaaba in another location," and he didn't mention any of that. On the contrary, he says, and he included part of the Hijr as in it. Now, the only way for him to know that he included the Hijr as part of it is for him to have known where the Hijr was. And obviously, for him to know where the Hijr was meant that Abdullah ibn Zubayr built the Kaaba, rebuilt the Kaaba in the exact same location, but included the Hijra as part of it. Because if Abdullah ibn Zubayr moved the Kaaba to another location, how would Yazid know whether he included the Hijra as part of it? Because there would be no Hijra, there would be a made-up Hijra. So obviously it's very clear that Abdullah ibn Zubayr rebuilt the Kaaba in the exact same location. And he says, I saw the foundation of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, stones like the humps of camels joined to one another. Now how can he see the foundations of Ibrahim if the Kaaba was being built in another location? It doesn't make any sense. Is the only way to explain it is Abdullah ibn Zubayr rebuilt the Kaaba, he dug out the foundations in the exact same location, and therefore that's the only way that Yazid could have seen the foundation of Ibrahim. That is the only way. So this is very, very clear evidence that Abdullah ibn Zubayr did not move the Kaaba. He did not rebuild the Kaaba in another location. He did not move Makkah. He did not pay all those people who lived in Makkah to move to another location. He didn't rebuild everything within a year. He didn't fake Hajj and Umrah and trick people to come there. It doesn't make any sense. So it's very clear Abdullah ibn Zubayr did not rebuild the Kaaba in another location. So this is a very, very strong piece of evidence, and this comes from the Caliphate of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. Now it says in Sahih Muslim that Abdullah ibn Ubayd reported that Harith bin Abdullah led a deputation to Abdul Malik bin Marwan during his Caliphate. Now who is Abdul Malik bin Marwan? He was the one who ordered the killing of Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr by Hajjaj bin Yusuf. And obviously now this is a hadith where Abdul Malik has said, "I do not think that Abu Khubayb ibn Zubayr had heard from Aisha about the intended wish of the Prophet in regards to the alteration of the Kaaba." Harith said, "Yes, I myself did hear from her." Here Abdul Malik said, "Well, tell me what you heard from her." The reason why he's asking about this is because Abdul Malik ordered for the Kaaba, that Abdullah ibn Zubayr, to be destroyed by Hajjaj bin Yusuf. Why? Because he didn't hear of this hadith. He didn't hear of the hadith or the narration by the Prophet that he wanted the Kaaba to be rebuilt in this way. So he thought that Abdullah ibn Zubayr was sort of creating a Kaaba that was contrary to the hadith of the Prophet. So then he says, "Tell me about it." He says, yes, that Aisha, she said that the Prophet remarked, "Verily your people have reduced the area of the house from its original foundation, and if they had not recently abandoned polytheism, etc., I would have made two doors on the level of the ground facing the east and west." Then Abdul Malik said to Harith, "Did you yourself hear her saying this?" He said, "Yes." Harith said that Abdul Malik bin Marwan, the Caliphate, the one who killed Abdullah ibn Zubayr, he scratched the ground with his staff for some time. And then he said, "I wish I had left Ibn al-Zubayr's work there. I wish I left his work there." Now, obviously, it's very, very clear then that the same location that Abdullah ibn Zubayr rebuilt the Kaaba is the same location that the Umayyad, the leader of the Umayyad, i.e. Abdul Malik bin Marwan, is also recognizing as the Kaaba location. Otherwise, why would Abdul Malik bin Marwan even consider saying, I wished I left his work there. If Abdullah ibn Zubayr moved the Kaaba to a fake location, Abdul Malik would have destroyed the Kaaba and would never have said, I wish I left Abdullah ibn Zubayr's work there. Regardless of whether if Abdullah ibn Zubayr's work was Abrahamic or not, if it's in the wrong location and the Umayyads recognize this, which Dan Gibson himself proclaims that the Umayyads recognize Petra as the location, and the Abbasids recognized Makkah as the location, but that's completely false, because from this hadith it's very clear that Abdul Malik bin Marwan wanted to preserve the work of Abdullah ibn Zubayr because he recognized that Abdullah ibn Zubayr was correct in not only the rebuilding of the Kaaba but the location. So it was an exact same location. It is very, very clear. Anyone who says that the Umayyads recognize in a different Kaaba is an absolute liar. It's absolute. From this hadith it's very clear that Abdul Malik was very sincere and he didn't know about this hadith. That's the reason why he said, I wish I kept Abdullah ibn Zubayr's work there. So this is very, very strong evidence against the false accusation that Abdullah ibn Zubayr moved the Kaaba. If you look on the right here, you can see that this was the Kaaba at the time of the Prophet, and he said, I wish I included can you see the part where it says Hatim? I wish I included that part as part of the Kaaba. In other words, in a rectangular form. So Abdullah ibn Zubayr built it in a rectangular form, and then Hajjaj bin Yusuf, by the order of Abdul Malik bin Marwan, destroyed that Kaaba and rebuilt it in this way here. Now, evidence number 6 is that Hajjaj doesn't turn towards Medina on his journey to Makkah from Syria. Now, it says in the History of Al-Tabari, volume 21, page 207, when Mus'ab bin al-Zubayr was killed, Abdul Malik bin Marwan sent Al-Hajjaj bin Yusuf against Ibn al-Zubayr in Makkah. Al-Hajjaj left with 2,000 men from the Syrian army during Jumada of the year 72. He did not turn towards Medina, but travelled along the Iraq road and encamped at Al-Ta'if. Now, this does not make sense if Makkah is in Petra. Why? Because you don't even turn towards Medina if you're going from Syria to Jordan. Like, Medina is not even, it's not even relevant, because if you're going from Syria to Jordan, you don't include Medina. It doesn't make any sense. So if you look on this map here, you can see the general route from Damascus or Syria to Makkah, and this is how it's explained. This is a way that makes the most sense. Now, normally when you go here, you can stop off at Medina, but what they did, Hajjaj bin Yusuf, they went through the Iraq route and then encamped at Al-Ta'if. Now, I don't know the exact reason why they did this, but they did this, and it says that they encamped at the Iraq route. Now, if you're going from Damascus to Petra, it doesn't make sense to go through an Iraq route and to encamp at Ta'if. It doesn't make any sense at all, because there is technically no Iraq route, because the Iraq route would have to go at least a route that would go from Iraq normally to Makkah. But if you're going from Damascus to Petra, there is no Iraq route. And second of all, you wouldn't even mention that he didn't turn towards Medina, because it's irrelevant. So it's very, very clear that this is a killer for the Petra argument. So the 7th piece of evidence is that Hajjaj bin Yusuf leads Hajj that year. Now, it says in Al-Tabari that Al-Hajjaj led the pilgrimage this year since Ibn al-Zubayr was besieged. Al-Hajjaj did not circumambulate the Kaaba, nor did he go to it in Pilgrim's Gharb. Now, this is very, very confusing, because the leader or the commander of an army does not leave the army. No, but it says Al-Hajjaj led the pilgrimage this year, so he must have performed Hajj. But obviously, if he was at Makkah, which was the fake Makkah that Abdullah ibn Zubayr was at now, because this is obviously around 71, 72 AH, so this is way after Abdullah ibn Zubayr supposedly moved the Kaaba, then this was the fake Makkah. So how did Hajjaj bin Yusuf perform Hajj? It doesn't make any sense unless he traveled all the way from the current location of Makkah to Petra, but that would have taken too long. It would have taken around 30 days just to go from Makkah to Petra, and then another 30 days to come back. By that time, Abdullah ibn Zubayr would have destroyed their army. So it's very clear that Hajjaj bin Yusuf was around that area and still performed Hajj. What does that mean? Hajjaj bin Yusuf had the same Kaaba and direction and Makkah as Abdullah ibn al-Zubair. And the evidence is very, very clear that he would not have left his army for 2 months to go and perform Hajj. The second thing is that it says that Abdullah ibn Zubair was besieged. Hajjaj bin Yusuf wanted to kill Abdullah ibn Zubair, but he couldn't because he was protected in Makkah. So it's very clear that Hajjaj bin Yusuf acknowledged the location that Abdullah ibn Zubair to be in, to be protected, to be a sacred location. Therefore, Hajjaj bin Yusuf recognized, and Abdul Malik bin Marwan recognized this location that Abdullah ibn Zaber to be at was the true Makkah. Al-Hajjaj bin Yusuf did not circumambulate the Kaaba. Now, if Hajjaj did go to Petra, why would he not circumambulate the Kaaba? If he knew where the Kaaba was, why wouldn't he not circumambulate the Kaaba? The reason is because his Makkah was the same as Abdullah ibn Zubair, and he could not enter Makkah because he was sieging Makkah and he was at war with Abdullah ibn Zubair. That's why he could only do what he could have done as far as what was permitted, because during war obviously he could not have entered the Kaaba, so therefore he could not have circumambulated it. It's very, very, very clear. Hajjaj bin Yusuf, Abdul Malik bin Marwan, the Umayyads, the Abdullah ibn Zubair, they all shared the same Kaaba, and there's so much evidence for it, and it just gets more and more. So the eighth evidence is that Abdul Malik ordered Hajjaj bin Yusuf to siege Makkah. Now it says in the history of Al-Tabari that from Awana, where Abdul Malik explicitly commands Al-Hajjaj to avoid any attack that would endanger the Kaaba. Instead, he was to block the road and starve out Ibn al-Zubair. Now this is extremely confusing if Dan Gibson is correct, that the Umayyads didn't recognize the current location of Makkah to be the correct location, that they recognized Petra to be the correct location, because this location is the current location at which Hajjaj bin Yusuf is stationed at. This is the current location at which Abdullah ibn Zubair is at. Now, don't you think it's confusing that Abdul Malik is saying do not endanger the Kaaba if he thought that this was the fake Kaaba? If Abdullah ibn Zubair was in fake Makkah, then there would be fake Kaaba. So Abdul Malik, who is the Umayyad, the leader of the Umayyad, would have already known this. Hajjaj bin Yusuf, who lives in that area, would have known this, and they would have known that this would have been a fake Kaaba, fake location, a fake sacred territory. So they wouldn't have cared to endanger a fake Kaaba. But he says instead block the road and starve out Ibn al-Zubair. So this was a sieging of Makkah. Now you'd only siege Makkah, for example, when they went to Medina, they stopped there for about 3 days and then they went into Medina and killed everyone, right? But when it comes to this location of Makkah, they sieged Makkah. Now this doesn't make any sense, because the only reason why you'd siege Makkah in this way is if you thought that Makkah was a sacred land. So that means that Abdul Malik bin Marwan, Hajjaj bin Yusuf recognized the same sacred area as Abdullah ibn al-Zubair. And it says in Tabari, volume 21, Al-Hajjaj then wrote to Abdul Malik asking his permission to besiege Ibn al-Zubair and enter the sacred territory against him. So he had to ask permission, but obviously it's very clear the same argument is, I'm going to keep saying the same argument. If Abdul Malik bin Marwan thought that this was a fake location, why would he need to give permission to enter the sacred territory against him? If Hajjaj didn't recognize this and Abdul Malik bin Marwan didn't recognize it, then it wouldn't have mattered. It also says Hajjaj bin Yusuf besieged Ibn al-Zubair for 8 months and 17 nights. This just shows how much they recognize this to be the sacred land. This is an unusually long time to siege a land where you have very, very small number of people in Makkah. Of course, Hajjaj bin Yusuf's army could defeat Abdullah ibn Zubair's army within a few days. So why siege it for so long? The only reason why is because وَلَوْ دَخَلَهُ كَانَ آمِنًا. Whoever enters Makkah is safe. So you cannot. So although they eventually did go into Makkah and kill Abdullah ibn Zubair, the fact that they had to wait for 8 months and 17 nights and they were persistent, it was very clear that they recognized this as the Makkah. This was the Makkah. This was the genuine Makkah. The Kaaba was the genuine Kaaba. That's why they had to be careful not to endanger it. So the ninth evidence is that Hajjaj bin Yusuf is from Al-Ta'if and Tihama. Now, during the siege, in History of Al-Tabari, it says that during the morning a thunderbolt struck and was followed by a second, killing 12 of his men. The Syrians became discouraged, but Al-Hajjaj said, "Men of Syria, do not consider this extraordinary. I am a native of Tihama." Now, what does this mean? Well, when the Syrians were sieging Makkah and Abdullah ibn Zaber, a thunderbolt struck them and it killed them. So the Syrians were thinking, wait a minute, maybe this is a sign that we shouldn't be sieging Abdullah ibn Zaber. So then Hajjaj bin Yusuf says, "Men of Syria, do not consider this extraordinary. I am a native of Tihama." Now, where was Hajjaj bin Yusuf from? Well, Hajjaj bin Yusuf's full name was Abu Musa al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf ibn al-Hakam ibn Aqil al-Thaqafi. Now, he was from the Banu Thaqif tribe. Now, as we mentioned before, the Banu Thaqif tribe, who had, I think, Alat, the temple of Alat, they were from Ta'if. Now, Ta'if is an area that is right next to Makkah. Now, he is saying, I am a native of Tihama. But we know that Tihama, if you look on the map on the right, it does not include Petra. So we know that Ta'if is right next to Makkah, but we also know that Tihama does not include Petra. So it must therefore follow that Makkah cannot be in Petra because, but it can be in the location it is now, but it cannot be in Petra because right next to Makkah is Ta'if, and Ta'if is included in Tihama, but Petra is not included in Tihama. Therefore, Petra cannot be the location of Makkah. Makkah cannot be in Petra, if that makes sense. So the correct location is the location now, and that makes more sense with regards to this sort of story. And Tihama is a very interesting place because there is a lot of stories I'll explain later on when I'm given the evidences against Petra, even more evidences against Petra with regards to Tihama, where some people have prophesied that they will see that their prophet will arise from Tihama. But obviously, if he was born in Petra, that wouldn't have made sense. So all these things all add up together, and I'll explain it later on. Now, the 10th piece of evidence is with regards to Hijaz. Now, in History of Al-Tabari, it says Ibn al-Zubayr has settled himself there near the Kaaba, where he used to stand and pray and perform circumambulation of the Kaaba throughout the day. Yet Hussein was the most unwelcome of God's creatures in the eyes of Ibn Zubayr because he realized that the people of Hijaz would not give the oath of allegiance to him and follow him as long as Hussein was in the town. So basically, Hijaz included Makkah. Now, that's the main point that you need to understand here, because when Abdullah ibn Zaber moved to Makkah, obviously he became in a position where people could accept allegiance to him, and obviously that included Hijaz because Makkah was in Hijaz. However, what is Hijaz? What is that area? If you look on the right here, you can see the area of Hijaz. And you can see that it doesn't include Petra, and especially with the Arabs, because the Romans later on, they decided to include as part of the term that they used as Hijaz to include southern Jordan. However, the Arabs did not include Jordan as part of Hijaz. And if you can see on the red here, the red outline, that is roughly where the Arabs considered Hijaz to be. So this is confusing because obviously now you know that therefore Makkah cannot be in Petra, because if Makkah is in Hijaz, then Makkah cannot be in Petra because Petra is not in Hijaz, if that makes sense. Again, it says that then Ibn Abbas went on to say, you would thrill Ibn al-Zubayr by your leaving him alone in the Hijaz and by your departure from it. So it's very clear that Makkah was in Hijaz. However, it's very clear also that Petra was not in Hijaz. So therefore Makkah cannot be in Petra because Makkah was in Hijaz, if that makes sense. And there's a lot of quotations about Hijaz as well. And obviously, I'm not going to go through all of them right now because it's a separate topic. I'll be talking about loads of evidences against the Petra argument. So, but for now, this is very shortened evidence. But it's very clear that if Hijaz is as it is, then therefore Makkah cannot be in Petra. Now, the 11th evidence is that there are various timelines in Dan's fairy tale. Now, if you look at the stories that Dan's been telling, you'll notice that all of these do not converge at a specific time. Instead, these are at various times that are far apart from each other, and it's just very unlikely. But what he does is he gets pieces of evidences from different times and different places, etc. And he says that this is evidence that this is when the Kaaba was moved. But it's completely, there's no sort of cumulative evidence or an evidence that converges at a specific time. They're all at different times and they're all far apart from each other. Look, check this out.
The Umayyads reacted strongly and sent an army against the holy city. Ibn Zubayr then did a shocking thing. He destroyed the Kaaba, the ancient holy shrine of Islam.
So he says that Abdullah ibn Zaber demolishes the Kaaba, okay? So obviously in Al-Tabari it mentions that he leads Hajj the next year or that year. So if you assume that, then he must have been able to move the Kaaba within a year. So if you assume this, or maybe within 2 years, okay, then you can say it was between 683 to 685 CE. Now check out the next part.
Look at this. For year 70, Al-Tabari only records a few lines of text. Did he not find any more information for this year? Or did later editors censor this year from Al-Tabari's record?
Now, he mentions here that Al-Tabari has little detail in 78 AH, which is very ridiculous evidence. It's not evidence at all for anything. But let's just say that it's between the years of 690 to 691 that he's assuming that the Kaaba was moved at this time. Now, already there's a bit of a confusion here because that obviously does not fit in well with Abdullah ibn Zubayr demolishing the Kaaba and then rebuilding it. So let's check out the next one.
It was said in the reign of Uthman that the Caliph ordered that signs be posted to the walls of the mosques in Medina. This was so that the pilgrims could easily identify the direction to which they needed to address their prayers.
Now this is a very interesting development because up until this time, mosques were built so the faithful had only to face the Qibla wall and they faced the holy city. Why would you need to introduce a sign unless the direction of prayer had changed?
Now he says that Uthman puts Qibla directions on mosques. Now when he says Uthman, he's talking about Uthman bin Affan, the Khalifa. Now this was ages before the time of Abdullah ibn Zubayr. This is in 644 to around 656 CE. So there is definitely some sort of confusion here, but I know exactly what he's doing. He knows that non-Muslims do not know anything about Uthman and Abdullah ibn Zaber, etc. So they would assume that this is talking about roughly the same time, but it's not. It's talking about a completely different time. So let's move on to the next one.
This Umayyad palace was built about 122 years after the founding of Islam. Now, if you remember, we looked at an Umayyad mosque built over here. This mosque points directly towards Petra. But when they built the palace, its Qibla direction was directly towards Mecca. So clearly, the Qibla direction changed sometime between the construction of those buildings and the construction of this palace.
So here he mentions that the Umayyad mosque in Amman, which faces different Qibla directions, was built between 730 to 750 CE, which was when it was built. And this expands the time span by which the Kaaba could have been changed. And in another place he mentions that the Prophet, the Kaaba was moved 100 years after the Prophet, which is around maybe 730 CE. So he's just expanding the timeline. And as you can see, all he's doing is he's getting little pieces of information and he's saying this is when the Kaaba was moved. This is who moved the Kaaba. This is, and it just does not add up. The time does not add up, and it should add up if such a momentous and such huge event happened. Everything should be lining up to that specific time, to a specific day. Yet he's just getting lots of different pieces of information, and it's very flimsy, and it's not evidence at all that supports the Petra argument. So let's summarize the points that we've been making in this discussion. So the first is that the governor of Makkah was not Abdullah ibn Zubair. When he moved there was another governor of Makkah, and I proved this. The second point was that the civil war was not based on what was the holiest city, and I proved this as well, that it had nothing to do with Damascus versus Makkah, nothing to do with that. The third point was that Ibn Zubayr did not move the Kaaba, and I showed plenty of evidences that supported this. And the fourth is that I showed 11 evidences against Petra from the book of Al-Tabari, because Dan Gibson quotes from Al-Tabari, so I used 11 evidences against Petra from Al-Tabari with regards to the Abdullah ibn Zubayr issue in particular. So that is to summarize the discussion and the topic of Abdullah ibn Zubayr and the Kaaba. And yeah, let's move on to the next topic. So in this section of Literary Vacuum and Imam Bukhari, we're going to analyze his claim that there was a literary vacuum and the only thing that was preserved was the Quran. And then he says even then that was just what people remembered. So let's analyze his claim.
First, it is my belief there was a literary vacuum in the early Islamic empire, created by zealous Muslims who destroyed books and manuscripts, erased inscriptions, burned libraries, and destroyed all literature except the Quran, which was mostly bits and pieces of what people remembered of the revelations that Muhammad gave.
Okay, so his claim is that the Muslims during the 7th and 8th century, for example, they burnt all literature, every single literature apart from the Quran, which in itself is a ridiculous claim because the literature of the Hadith, for example, is preserved. So I don't understand his claim anyway. But let's analyze his evidence and let's see if it actually matches up to his premise.
This destruction of written material by the Islamic forces has been well documented. One piece of evidence is a letter from 640 AD from the Caliph to General Amru, the leader of the Muslim armies in Egypt, who asked the Caliph what should he do with the thousands of manuscripts he found in warehouses in Alexandria. The Caliph's answer has been recorded and known for centuries.
As for the books you mention, here is my reply. If their content is in accordance with the revelations of Allah, we may do without them. For in that case, the revelations of Allah more than suffice. If, on the other hand, they contain matter not in accordance with the revelations of Allah, there can be no need to preserve them. Proceed then and destroy them.
So this is the evidence that he can provide to support his claim that there was a literary vacuum. So he quotes a man called Bar Hebrius, who is a Christian, who's from the 13th century, and who's claiming that something happened in the 7th century at the time of Umar ibn Khattab, and something happened in with regards to the library, and Amr ibn al-As, who was the governor of Egypt, and how he burnt stuff in the library. Now, this is a claim, and this is a false claim from Bar Hebrius, who's not quoting anyone, and he has no chain of narrations. So first thing is that there is no evidence whatsoever. Just because someone 600 years later claims that something happened is very, very unreliable. And he doesn't quote anyone. He doesn't say, I'm quoting this person who is from for example, the 8th century or the 9th century. He's just saying this is what happened, and it's absolutely false. So that's the first thing, that this man is a Christian, so obviously it's unreliable as far as Muslims are concerned. He's from the 13th century and he doesn't quote anyone. So this is the first reason why it's absolutely false.
But Bukhari is writing some 200 years after Muhammad, and he's writing more than 100 years after the Qibla change took place. So he's not an eyewitness. He's just collecting what people are remembering.
Now, bear in mind that he criticizes Imam Bukhari, who was born 200 years after the time of the Prophet, and he says there is no way that his hadith can be reliable because it's 200 years after the time of the Prophet. But here he's quoting someone 600 years after the time of Umar ibn Khattab, and he's saying that this person did this. But the difference is Imam Bukhari has a chain of narrations, and he basically has a list of people who he's heard it from in a chain that links up to the Prophet. For example, here's an example here where he heard from Makki ibn Ibrahim, who heard from Yazid ibn Abi Ubaid, who heard from Salama ibn al-Aqwa, who heard from the Prophet that he said that whoever ascribes to me what I have not said intentionally, then surely let him occupy his seat in hellfire. So Imam Bukhari, not only was he quoting from a chain of narrations, so you know exactly who he's heard it from and who they've heard it from, but also Imam Bukhari was known for his photographic memory. He was an absolute genius, and he was basically like a machine. He could absorb knowledge like a sponge. He would, at the time when he was a teenager, he memorized thousands of hadith or narrations from the Prophet. So we're comparing two people here. One that was born 600 years after Umar ibn Khattab, and he's quoting that Umar ibn Khattab did something without any chain of narrations, without any quoting anyone. And then you're trying to compare him with Imam Bukhari and say Imam Bukhari is unreliable. Imam Bukhari is way more reliable than this Bar Hebrius guy who's a Christian. Imam Bukhari quotes from a chain of narration, and I will explain about him later on. But I just want to compare here because he quotes and he says that Imam Bukhari was unreliable because he's born 200 years after the time of the Prophet. But I'm going to show later on that it can be actually really, really reliable depending on the circumstance. Now, it is true that in the American Journal of Semitic Languages and Literatures, which was a book from the 1911, that they say that this quotation from Bar Hebrius is well supported, but let's analyze what it actually says. So this is the reference here. It's on page 335, and it explains the actual story. So it says, in his Al-Tarikh, Bar Hebrius says that when Yahya the Coptic philosopher petitioned Amr al-As, the Muslim conqueror of Egypt, to restore the royal library to the public, the latter referred the matter to Umar ibn Khattab, the second Khalif. The Khalif ordered him to destroy the library on the ground that if the books were in accord with the Quran alone was sufficient, and if at variance with it, etc. Then he mentions the Muslim position, that this is unreliable, that Bar Hebrius is an unreliable person, and therefore you cannot use him as a source of reliability. Obviously he's only just quoting, he's not quoting from anyone. But then he analyzes his position and he says, actually the Bar Hebrius passage is authentic and based on Arabian authorities, is a fact which has been abundantly verified by one who may be considered a very high authority on things Muhammadan. So then let's analyze his evidence for it. So he says that there are two independent authorities. One is Abdul Latif of Baghdad, who visited Egypt in the latter part of the 6th century AH. Now again, this is not reliable. 6th century AH. Remember, this is not 6th century AD. This is 6 centuries after the time of Umar ibn Khattab, after the time of the Prophet. So again, this is not reliable. You can't be quoting someone from the same century as you and using that as a sort of reliable evidence, because then you'd need to get where that person is quoting from and where that person is getting his evidence from. And he quotes from the other authority is Jamal ad-Din al-Kufti, who's also from the 6th century AH, which is from the 12th century, 13th century, for example. So this is not reliable evidence. You can't be quoting people who are also around your time as evidence. That's not evidence. You can't be quoting two people from the 13th century. If you are going to make a reliable point, at least quote someone from the 8th century or the 9th century, then that will create some reliability. But quoting two people from the 13th century in the same century as you are is not evidence at all. So even this sort of justification and an attempt to try and make it a fact is absolutely false. It's not true at all. Another thing is that this event has nothing to do with Islamic literature. This is when Amr ibn al-As, when Umar ibn Khattab conquered Egypt, and he put Amr ibn al-As as the governor of Egypt. So this is when they've just basically conquered Egypt. So in their libraries, there's no Islamic literature. This is all non-Muslim literature. So even if this is correct, it's not correct, and this is just a fabrication that was made in the 13th century. But even if it is correct, it has nothing to do with Islamic literature. This is about non-Muslim literature. So in effect, this goes against like his argument that Islamic literature and the only thing that was preserved was the Quran, and all Islamic literature was destroyed. No, this is referring to non-Muslim literature. That is the reason why it says that if they were in accordance with the Quran, then the Quran alone was sufficient. So this is with regards to non-Islamic literature. So that's just to be very clear. So the argument itself is meaningless. So him quoting Bar Hebrews, it doesn't mean anything because it's not even about Islamic literature.
With the Persian armies in the Battle of Qadisiyah in the year 636 AD. In early January 637, the Muslim advance guard reached the outskirts of Ctesiphon and laid siege to the city for 2 months. Eventually the city fell and the Muslims occupied it. During the fighting, the palaces and the library at Ctesiphon were deliberately burned. In the end, the only book that managed to survive in Arabia was the glorious Quran.
So now he mentions an event that happened in Ctesiphon, which is in Iraq. And what happened was supposedly the Muslims conquered Ctesiphon and they laid siege to it and they burnt some of the books in the library, supposedly. Now, first thing is that he doesn't quote anyone. And the reason why is because it's completely made up and with no evidence at all. He doesn't quote a single historian or a single scholar that affirms this. But the second thing is that even if it is correct, it has nothing to do with Islamic literature, because this is when the Muslims are conquering a non-Muslim country and the library has non-Muslim literature in it. So even if the library was burnt down, it doesn't affect the reliability of Islamic literature or the preservation of Islamic literature, because this evidence has nothing to do with Islamic literature. It's just, so I don't understand why he's even making the point. First thing that he quotes is from Alexandria, when they conquered Alexandria. Again, that library had non-Muslim literature in it. Then he quotes this one where it also has non-Muslim literature in it. So even if both of the two stories are true, which I've proven that they're probably not because they have no evidence for it, but even if they are true, it has nothing to do with Islamic literary vacuum. If he's referring to a non-Muslim literary vacuum, then that's fair enough, because we don't really care, because we're concerned about Islamic preservation, because that's what he's claiming, that there was nothing preserved in Arabia or Islam apart from the Quran. But he's not backed it up with any sort of evidence. So then he says, in the end, the only thing that was preserved in Arabia was the Quran. But he's not provided any evidence that any Islamic literature at all was destroyed anywhere. He's quoted Alexandria, but even if something did happen there, that has nothing to do with Islamic literature. Then he quotes from Ctesiphon when they conquered Ctesiphon. Again, it has nothing to do with Islamic literature. So for him to then say, in the end, the only thing that was preserved was the Quran, but it doesn't make any sense, because first of all, he's saying in Arabia, but then he's quoting from something that happened in Iraq and Egypt, and he's saying the only thing that was preserved was the Quran. Well, where's the evidence that the hadith were not preserved and anything else was not preserved? Where's the evidence? You haven't brought any evidence of that at all. So it's very clear what he wants to do. He's just trying to make it sound like it's correct. And you notice this a lot, that what he does is he tries to make it sound nice. I mean, the documentary is very nice. The way he's ordered things, the tunes, he got it perfectly correct, but 99% of the things that he's saying is completely false and completely fabricated. So obviously this is for non-Muslims. So this documentary is basically for non-Muslims who don't do any research and who just believe everything he says.
Remember, the Islamic Empire at this time stretched from the Atlantic Ocean through the Middle East all the way to Afghanistan. And only 5 or 6 copies of the Quran existed in all those millions of square kilometers. This is what I refer to when I speak of a literary vacuum.
So here he's referring to the time of Uthman and when he sent out some copies to the Muslim lands. Now he says that it extended from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Afghanistan. Now this is a lie. If you look at the map that he's shown you, it's an absolute false map, because During the time of Uthman, those lands were not conquered by the Muslims yet. Morocco, Algeria, and Spain were not conquered by the Muslims yet. Afghanistan. If you look at this map here, you can see that what the Prophet expanded Islam to, what was expanded during the Rashidun Caliphate, which included Abu Bakr Siddiq, Umar bin Khattab, Uthman bin Affan, and Ali. But obviously, even the Rashidun Caliphate was not complete. This was not completely done by Uthman because he still had Ali to conquer even more lands. So extend sort of Asia. So if you look at here, you can see the expansion during the Rashidun Caliphate. That's the most you can say was conquered by the Muslims. So the first thing that I want to correct here is Dan's map's absolutely false, and he lied to say that it extended from the Atlantic Ocean to Afghanistan. This was not conquered until the Umayyad dynasty. So that's the first lie. So the second thing that he says is that there were 5 or 6 copies that were sent to the Islamic world. Now, this is actually not true. There's a difference of opinion as to how many copies there were. In this book called The History of the Quranic Text by Muhammad Mustafa al-Azmi, who was a Cambridge professor, he acknowledges that there's difference of opinion how many copies were sent. So some say there were 4, some say there were 8, and some say there were 9. Some say that because obviously they will be sending it to Kufa, Basra, and Syria. So you can look at these places and then you can understand which locations were 100% conquered by the Muslims. And if you look at the last opinion, where you see Kufa, Basra, Medina, Makkah, Egypt, Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, and Al Jazeera, you can see that this was the general area that was conquered by the Muslims. You don't have Spain. There's no Quran sent to Spain because that wasn't conquered yet. Algeria, Morocco, Libya, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all these other countries, copies were not sent there because it was not conquered at that time. It was only conquered at the time of the Umayyad dynasty. So that's another thing, that the amount of copies that he says 5 or 6, well, that's not necessarily true. There could have been up to 9 copies that were sent. So the third thing that he does is that he gives the false impression that these 5 or 6, he says 5 or 6 copies across millions of kilometers were the only ones that were to be used and to be there present. But this is further from the truth. First of all, I explained that there was probably 8 or 9. Second thing is that this wasn't across millions of kilometers across the Atlantic Sea to the Afghanistan. It was much smaller than this area. And the last thing is that Uthman did not prohibit people from making copies. He sent out teachers along with these mushaf, these Qurans, and he sent it to these nations to teach people. So what they would do is they would teach these people, and then they would make even more copies. The only thing Uthman prohibited was those fragments of the Quran were to be burnt or destroyed, those that were different to his. So if you're going to make a copy that's the same as the Uthmani one, that's perfectly fine. So when Uthman was sending out these copies, of course he was sending out these copies with the intention of them making more copies from it. And that's what we have today, because we don't have those ones that were sent exactly from Uthman, but we do have the copies that were made from it. So it's very clear that he's given the wrong impression that these copies, these 5 or 6 copies, were the only ones that existed, and they existed for years, and they were the only ones that existed. It's absolutely false. It's a false idea that he's given non-Muslims, so that obviously, to trick them.
There is a great divide here between Western thought and Muslim thought. In Western thought, the later manuscripts are less reliable, as they are copies of copies. We need to go back to earlier source material, as it's more accurate. Muslims, on the other hand, think earlier manuscripts are less reliable, and later manuscripts replace earlier manuscripts.
Now here is another lie that he says, which is there is a division with regards to the Islamic thought of the manuscripts and the Western thought of the manuscripts. Of course, we don't disregard the older manuscripts because they correspond with the Quran that we have today, and they correspond with the newer manuscripts and all the manuscripts. There's no discrepancies between them two, and therefore there is no need for us to reject the older manuscripts because they are perfectly in line with the newer manuscripts. So this idea that there is a division of thought and we think differently is absolutely false. Of course, if you look at the oldest manuscripts, this proves that the Quran is perfectly preserved because they match exactly with what we have today and the copies that we have today. And for him to say that we believe that the newer manuscripts replace the older manuscript, it makes no sense because they correspond to each other. So if there's an older manuscript, it might not have, for example, the diacritical marks and these the for example, like the fatha, these dots, etc. But they're still corresponding with the newer manuscripts and with the copies of the Quran.
Abu Bakr, the successor of Muhammad, made the first compilation of Quranic material. Uthman, who followed him, used that collection and then added to it. The historians tell us that even after Uthman had compiled his Quran, people remembered still more verses that Muhammad had revealed. Every time a new Quran came out, it was touted as the most complete Quran. The previous ones were okay, but the newer ones were more complete, with more revelations in them.
So this is another lie, and this is one of the biggest lies that he said. I mean, he makes up so many lies, but this is one of the biggest lies. He says that Uthman, when he was compiling his Quran, he was adding things to Abu Bakr Siddiq's Quran. So he was basically getting Abu Bakr Siddiq's Quran and remembering some things that the Prophet said and adding it to the Quran. This is absolutely false. If you look at the hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari, in so many places it says, narrated by Anas bin Malik, so Uthman sent a message to Hafsa because she had the copy from Abu Bakr Siddiq, and he said to her, send us the manuscripts of the Quran so that we may compile the Quranic materials in perfect copies and return the manuscripts to you. So he's going to make perfect copies of the Mus'haf of Hafsa, the Quran that Hafsa has. He wants to make perfect copies of it. So obviously he's not adding anything to it if he's going to make perfect copies of it. He only wanted to borrow it to compare with his version, and he found no discrepancies between the two. So he says he got specific companions of the Prophet, included Abdullah ibn Zaber, which Dan Gibson said moved the Kaaba, and he says he ordered them to rewrite the manuscripts in perfect copies. So these copies were of the Quran, and obviously these were not different to Abu Bakr Siddiq if he's making copies of them. In the history of the Islamic text on page 93, he narrates that Uthman then sent to Hafsa and asked to borrow the suhuf which had been entrusted to her. She gave it to him only after he vowed to return it. In comparing these two, his one and Hafsa's one, which was from Abu Bakr Siddiq, he said, I found no discrepancies, so I gave it back to Uthman, and he, with an elated spirit, ordered the people to make duplicate copies of the Mus'haf. So he compared his one to Abu Bakr Siddiq's one, and he found that there was no difference between them. There was no disagreement between them. So it's very clear that Uthman did not add anything to the Quran of Abu Bakr Siddiq. And you might ask, so why then did he make an independent copy, and why is it called a Uthman copy and not Abu Bakr Siddiq copy? Well, because it mentions here that a decade earlier, thousands of companions engaged in the battles against apostasy in Yamama and elsewhere were unable to participate in the Suhuf's compilation. So they were away with battles. So they didn't. There was a smaller pool of people who were able to draw their knowledge and testify and bring their fragments. So what Uthman wanted to do was make sure that all these companions had the chance to contribute to the compilation of the Quran and not be deprived because they went to battle. So at the time of Uthman, he made it his own independent copy, and then he compared it with Hafsa's. He goes on to say, in the above account, no inconsistencies were found between the Suhuf and the independent Mus'haf, and from this two broad conclusions emerge. First, the Quranic text was thoroughly stable from the earliest days and not fluid and volatile into the 1st century, as some people say. And secondly, the methods involved in compilation during both reigns were meticulous and accurate. Because imagine, but during both reigns, there was no discrepancies. It was perfect with each other. So this is absolute lie that Dan Gibson says that Uthman was adding things to the Quran of Abu Bakr Siddiq, and other people were adding things to Uthman's copy. It's absolute lie. There's no evidence. And he keeps saying this. Early historians say this. Early historians say this. Which historians? He keeps saying historians say this because he wants to make it up. He wants to lie about Islam. He wants to lie about everything. So he keeps saying historians say this, but he doesn't mention any. So to summarize then, although this topic had nothing to do with the Petra argument per se, but I did have to address this because some of the arguments were so silly, and unless you're a Muslim, you'd just believe what he says, and you'd think, it's quite reasonable what he's saying, but what he's saying is an absolute lie, and he's making up so many lies that I had to make these videos because it's absolutely incumbent for me to show non-Muslims and Muslims as well who don't know this, that what he's saying and his Petra argument is so weak and it's full of plain lies about Islam, especially this section about Islamic literature and a literary vacuum, where the first evidence where he's trying to claim that there was an Islamic literary vacuum, he mentions Alexandria and Iraq when they're being conquered and the libraries are being burnt. First of all, they're made up stories. Second of all, they don't even have nothing to do with Islamic literature. That's with regards to non-Muslim, non-Islamic literature. Then he goes on to try and justify that Islam had only 5 copies that were sent across millions of kilometers and miles away from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Afghanistan, when I very, very clearly explained that it was during the Rashidun Caliphate that these copies were sent, so you can't include the Umayyad dynasty as part of the Muslim colonized areas. It doesn't make any sense. And then he goes on to mention that people were adding things to the Quran, and it was just false. And then he goes on to say that, these copies, these were the only ones that existed. So I've basically very, very clearly shown that he's just lied about so many things about the Quran, about the Petra argument, so many things he's made up, misled specific arguments, mistranslated, misquoted, misinterpreted. So I think I've done justice on explaining his argument and how false it is. And I'm going to move on to the next section, which is actual argument against the Petra argument. Now, I know I've given so many evidences against the Petra argument, but this is my independent study on the arguments that go against the Petra argument that Makkah was in Petra. For example, the companions migrating to Abyssinia, and how would they migrate to Abyssinia if they're in Petra? It wouldn't make any sense. So things like that I go through. So feel free to follow me to the next section.